Welcome to Capital Connections. I'm John O'Connor, your host. We're coming to you from the H. Raymond Danforth Library on the campus of New England College. Did you know that in the last 15 years, opioid overdose deaths have quadrupled? And now drug overdoses kill more people than car crashes. For the next 4 weeks, we will focus our attention on the opioid crisis in Vermont, New Hampshire, and northern New York. Our mental health can be compromised by so many things, like sudden loss, complex trauma, chronic illness, co-occurring disorders, and more. Without proper diagnosis and treatment, people often self-medicate and begin a dangerous cycle that adds even more challenges to their lives and the lives of others. Recently, New England College hosted a panel on mental health and the opioid crisis at their Concord, New Hampshire Center. The panelists included John Broderick, the former Chief Justice of the New Hampshire Supreme Court, Dr. Paul Dan, Program Director of the New England College Master's Degree Program in Clinical Mental Health Counseling, and the Executive Director of NFI North, a multi-service behavioral health organization. Peter Evers, the CEO of Riverbend Community Health Center, and attorney Michelle Merritt, Policy Director of New Futures, an organization that works to prevent and reduce substance abuse problems. The panel was moderated by Scott Spradling, an Emmy Award-winning media leader and consultant. When we come back, we'll hear the heartbreaking story of Chief Justice Broderick's family's crisis as his son struggled with mental illness, addiction, prison, and finally recovery, proof that it can happen to anybody. But first, these messages from the good businesses that believe a well-informed community is the greatest strength in sustaining a strong democracy. Welcome back to Capital Connections. For the next 4 weeks, we'll be looking at the opioid crisis in Vermont, New Hampshire, and northern New York, and the related mental health issues. Today, without commercial interruption, John Broderick, the former Chief Justice of the New Hampshire Supreme Court, tells us his story of his family's struggle to help their son.
This topic of mental illness and mental health is very personal to me. And the campaign that I'm co-chairing with Bill Gunn from Concord Hospital and Peter Evers from Riverbend means the world to me. I was speaking in this very room this afternoon. Some of you may have been here. I apologize for that. When I was 10 years old, my best friend lived across the street. His father was an MIT graduate, and his father's brother was an inpatient at Danvers Mental Hospital. I call it the Nut House. All my friends did, and adults called it the Nut House too. How insensitive was that? On Sunday afternoons, this gentleman who was otherwise confined would come to his brother's home for a cookout. And so from the safety of my front yard as a 10-year-old, I would watch him walk around the house, stop to look at the flowers by the garage, and I'd never cross the street on those Sundays because I would be too afraid to do that. And when he finally got in his brother's car and they left the neighborhood, I was relieved. I had no idea where he was going, what it was like at Danvers, but I knew he wasn't in my town anymore. That was my first exposure to mental illness. I don't know what that gentleman's problems were. But some decades later, in a different state, this state, in a different town and on a different road, mental illness crossed that street and entered my own family. And it took our president and my 13-year-old son. I had 2 children. I didn't see it. My wife didn't see it. My son didn't know he had a mental health problem. As the years passed, he graduated from high school, went to college. He's really smart, but he was going on 2 cylinders, I thought. Then he went to graduate school, and he started drinking in college, which happens to a lot of young people, so it wasn't alarming. But by graduate school, he was really drinking. And finally it got to the point where my wife and I was on the Supreme Court at the time. We were told that we should send him to rehab. He went to 3 different rehabs. One in New Hampshire, one in Massachusetts, one in Florida. None of them worked. And he came home drinking. And finally they said to us, here are your choices. You can put your son on the street, maybe he'll hit bottom and come back. Or he can stay in your home and he'll die drinking. Those are your choices. No one said he might have a foundational mental health problem, or maybe has a co-occurring disorder. No one said that. And I was so ignorant, I never thought of it. Because I thought, if I thought at all, I would have said, how could my son have a mental health problem? Isn't that silly? It's silly. Mental health doesn't respect your 1040, your job title, your zip code. It has no respect for it. Finally, and my wife, I said to the group this afternoon, my wife is the sweetest human being on the planet Earth. I'm a little biased, but I've been married for 46 years, so I know her pretty well. I'm 45 years old, so I don't know how that works. That's my story. But in any event, so for her to put my son out, I mean, I just can't describe it. And so we did that. And I would drive to Concord every day to go to the court, and I would wonder where my son was. He was sleeping in his car. He was eating at the soup kitchen. He went to the shelter. That was the worst decision that my wife and I ever made. It was made for good intention, but it was a terrible decision. And finally, we brought my son back home, resigning ourselves to the fact that he might die drinking in our house. But at least he'd be in a warm and safe place. He was afraid that I would put him out again, and he assaulted me. I ended up in the ICU, and my son ended up in the Valley Street Jail and ultimately in the state prison. And I was on the Supreme Court, and at the time it got a fair amount of press across the state. Man bites dog. And I remember when my wife finally told me, my wife who had shuttled from the ICU to the Valley Street Jail, I hope you don't ever have to do that. I don't know how my wife survived, to be honest. She was an amazing person. When she finally told me, and I was in a hospital bed, and she was standing there, and we both started crying, because I knew what it meant. I knew what it meant. And some months later, my son was sentenced to the state prison. I hadn't seen him in those months. And it was in courtroom 5 at Hillsborough County Superior Court. And I was waiting for him to come in. And he came in, and he came over to me, and he gave me a big hug, and he said, Dad, I don't know if I can ever forgive myself for what I did to you. I said, Christian, we got into this as a family. I made mistakes. We got into it as a family. We're going to get out of it as a family unless you quit on me. But if you quit, Mom and I'll quit. He said, I won't quit then. And then he was sentenced to 7.5 to 15 years at the state prison. My master-educated, handsome, smart son. And he had 4 years suspended off the minimum, so he had to do 3.5 years. He had done 6 months, so he had 3 years in the state prison. So we went up there after 60 days, they would let us visit. We met with the head psychiatrist at the state prison, Dr. Knowles. Always be indebted to that man. So we sat with him, and he said, I really like your son. I said, I love my son. He said he has all the life skills you need to be successful, but he has serious mental health issues. He's got serious depression, anxiety, and panic attacks that are almost off the charts. And if I said to you, if you had those problems, if you drank a six-pack every day, you'd feel better for a while. Wouldn't be a good choice, but it wouldn't be illogical. He was self-medicating, Judge. We're going to work with him, see what we can do. And they did. And within about 6 months, on some medical regimen, he said to me, Dad, I woke up this morning and I've never felt like this before. I could focus, I could sleep. Oh, he said, it was unbelievable. He got married in prison. I performed his wedding in a conference room off the main visiting room of the state prison. I don't recommend that, by the way. but the reception's cheap. And there he was getting married. I'm looking at the Coke machine and the people going up to get the Cokes. And the wedding photographer was an inmate with a Polaroid camera. And I said, "What do you charge?" He said, $1 a picture. I said, "You are my kind of photographer." And so the wedding happened. His wife later won an Emmy for her work on film in New England, twice nominated and once a winner. I've held the Emmy. I said, "Did I win this?" She said, "No." I would have taken it. They now have an 8-year-old daughter. I'm her grandfather, but she is the most beautiful child. I mean, she's a beautiful child. And every time I hug her, I think, you are a miracle. You're a miracle. So I know what the journey is. I don't know the science like Bill Gunn and Peter Evers know it. But I do know the dark side, and I do know the upside. And I do know the mistakes I made. Not ill-intended, but made them because of ignorance. And my son, who I love dearly, is so proud that we're doing this, that I'm out here doing this, which means the world to me and to my wife. He's taught me a lot. He's maybe one of the bravest people I've ever met. He lived in a bubble for years. No one knew it. He didn't know it. Finally, we thought we knew it, and we diagnosed a symptom for his illness. He hadn't had a drink in a dozen years. He said, "Dad, I feel great." When he went to the prison, they gave him an IQ test. He was 3 points below genius. He said to me, "I was 3 points below genius, Dad." I said, "You couldn't be a genius?" He said, "Dad, when they gave me the IQ test, I had shackles on my ankles, and they were watching me through a two-way mirror. That's got to be worth 3 points." So I said, "You're a genius." And he probably is, actually. So I'm here tonight because of this campaign called Change Direction. I wish it were my idea, but I know great ideas when I see them. Barbara Van Dalen is a child psychologist in Maryland. Bill Gunn is her dear friend. She called Bill Gunn, and he called me and said, "Can you call her?" And so I did. She was on Time Magazine's 100 list in 2012, the 100 most influential people on Earth. Now, we've all been on that list at one time or another in our dreams. And so I called Barbara. I said, "What are you trying to do?" She said, "I'll tell you what I'm trying to do, John. I'm trying to make the 5 most common signs of mental illness as well known and widely known as the signs for a heart attack or a stroke." That's an ingenious idea. She said, "I bet you know the signs for a heart attack or a stroke." I said, "Actually, I do. I didn't go to medical school." She said, "You know them because people tell you them. They don't talk about mental health. We're still ashamed of that." I know that. I learned that early. And so Bill Gunn and Peter Evers and I and Scott Spradling back here has been great. We've been trying to take this campaign statewide. We're the first state in the country. And the reception it's receiving is extraordinary. I'm just trying to give you a couple of stories, and then I'm going to ask for your help to take one of these cards, put it on your refrigerator, learn the 5 signs, share them with your children or your grandchildren or your neighbors or your spouse, and start talking about mental illness like we talk about everything else. Everyone with a mental health problem has 2 things in common. Everyone has these 2 things in common. Number 1, they didn't ask for a mental health problem, and 2, they don't deserve it. And once you accept that, which I think you have to accept, what are we doing about it? What are we doing?
Feeding them drugs.
Yeah, some of us are. That's exactly right. He said some of us are on drugs or alcohol, self-medication. It's time we grew up. I've been going around to high schools. Now, I'm only 45 years old, and these kids look really young to me, which is alarming. They look 12 years old to me, so maybe I'm older than I let on. But I've been going to high schools and have assemblies. I talk to kids and I talk to teachers. And after each assembly, it doesn't matter where I go, kids will come up. They have 10 minutes to go to the next class. It's not exactly a private setting. I'm in the front of an auditorium. These kids will come up to me, most of them with tears in their eyes. I must be like their grandfather. And they say to me, thank you for coming to my school and talking about this. And I always say to them, are you having mental health issues? And they say, yes. And I say, you're getting help? And they say, yes. I said, how are your friends supporting you? They say, you can't tell your friends. I won't have any friends if I tell them. 2016, folks. To those kids trapped in that place, it's like being gay in 1955. I'm old enough to remember 1955. You didn't tell your parents, your friends. Oh, my God. You would never tell your employer. You would have had no friends. You would have been ostracized. Now we have gay marriage. Country's come a long way. We've never had the same jump for mental illness. When I was a kid, a friend of mine, his mother was sick, and I said to my mother one day in the kitchen, in the privacy of our kitchen, I said to my mother, what's wrong with Jimmy's mother? She looked mortified, really mortified. And she was going to have to tell me something. And she leaned over. Now we're alone in our kitchen. I'd come in from playing. She leaned over and she whispered the word cancer. She whispered the word cancer. And I thought as a kid, well, maybe if you said that out loud, you could get cancer. Why is she whispering it? It was just the two of us. The only adult from my childhood who ever said the word breast publicly was Hugh Hefner. It's true. Playboy magazine, 1954. He was the only adult. So we whispered cancer, and only one adult said the word breast. And some decades later, some brave soul or soul said, why don't we put breast and cancer together, get a megaphone of color, go to the town square, and change the outcomes for hundreds of thousands of women? The Patriots wear pink, the Red Sox is bathed in pink. Mental health is in the shadows. In the 1980s, when we heard about AIDS, you remember that? It was frightening. And people said, maybe they're bad people. Maybe that's why they have AIDS. Could I get AIDS if I'm in the same town, if I breathe the same air, if I touch them, could I get AIDS? And then Magic Johnson of the Los Angeles Lakers went to a bank of microphones one day in Los Angeles and said, I have HIV. And suddenly it was not only okay to have HIV, it was imperative that we find a cure, or at least treatment. He's still living, by the way. It used to be a death sentence. Mental health has never had a Magic Johnson moment. And the reason I feel so strongly about this is my own family's journey and all the stories that people have shared with me. People would come up to me and say, my mother, my sister, my father, my brother, my cousin. Sometimes they talk about themselves because I was safe and non-judgmental and pretty ignorant. Not now. I'm not ignorant now. And so when I go around to these schools and I see these people, I think, my God, what are we doing to this generation? What is so shameful? And by the way, the stigma, that's a huge deal. You know what the stigma is? It's every one of us. We're the stigma. They don't bring them in from Jupiter. It's the people. Those kids in those high schools are afraid of us and what we'll think and say and do. It's our problem at that point. And we need to change it. And so that's why I'm here tonight. I'm the front end of this program. Pretty soon you'll find out from the people who know what they're talking about. But I know the journey of mental health. That I know. I know what's possible. I know what ignorance can do. And I would not be here at all talking about my family if I could have hidden it. I'm not trying to be righteous here tonight. Trust me. I understand why people hide it. It doesn't help, by the way. Doesn't help. Let me finish with this. When I talk to groups and I say we're going to change the culture around mental health by learning the signs, talking about the signs, encouraging people, I think it seems like a big journey to a lot of people. And it may be. Changing the culture is not easy, but then again, if we change our attitude, it's very easy. Let me finish with this as an illustration. When I was 12, my parents took my sister and me to dinner every Thursday night in our town. I had no idea why Thursday night was tonight, but it was payday. I found that out years later. So we went out, and my sister and I would jump into the back seat of my father's big blue Impala, which had no seatbelts. That was okay. And we drove to the town, and we went to the restaurant, and every table in the restaurant had an ashtray. Every single table had an ashtray. And at some point during the night, every table was smoking. Usually at dessert and coffee. I never understood that, but that's when people smoked. And my sister and I would be breathing in the smoke. My parents loved us. My parents would be smoking. I'd be breathing in their smoke. And then we'd go out of the restaurant, get back in the car with no seatbelts. My parents would light up in the car and bring the window down about an inch. That was a great filter system, apparently. And then we get home to our house where we had dining room with an ashtray, a living room with an ashtray, a kitchen table, it was everywhere. Find an ashtray today. Find one. I don't even know if they exist anymore. My sister used to make them in pottery class. Imagine? They're now gone. If you smoke on the Boston Common outside, it's a violation of a city ordinance to smoke outside. If you had said to that kid in that restaurant years ago, in your lifetime, do you think you'll see ashtrays disappear? I would have laughed. That same 12-year-old kid used to watch the 15-minute nightly news with his parents on our black and white TV. And sometimes there'd be African Americans being attacked by police dogs. And through the eyes of a 12-year-old, it's pretty disturbing. And I would say to my mother, is that happening in a faraway place? And she always looked embarrassed, and she said, no, it's happening in our country, in the United States. If you would ask that kid that night, do you think one day during your lifetime there'll be an African-American president of the United States? I would have said, with certainty, never happening. Thank you, Barack Obama. I don't know the president, but when he was elected and sworn in, I went to Washington, because my mother would have said, you be down there. She would have been. And so I stood on the mall with 1.3 million of my closest friends. Barack Obama looked 2 inches tall from my great vantage point, but he was 20 feet tall on the Jumbotron. And that morning, as I was watching this, I was thinking of that 12-year-old kid, and I thought, what was impossible in my lifetime is now part of the history of the United States and part of my lifetime. Things change. We can change the culture on mental health and mental illness. It's long past time. We need to stop the shame and the embarrassment. And we need to reach a generation of kids who are in the shadows and who, as this young man said, may be taking drugs or alcohol. Why do we do that? It makes no sense to me.
Cover things up.
I'm sorry?
To cover things up.
That may be true, too. It's an unpleasant thing, by the way. But it's really not. Why do we make people ashamed? We don't make gay Americans ashamed anymore. We did it one time. We need to grow up. As my wife would say in various circumstances, it's time we put our big boy pants on. I think she's right on this issue. It's time we put our big boy pants on and start talking about it. Thank you for coming tonight. I'm going to leave these up here if you want them, and if I'll leave a card here too. So if you want it and they're not there, you can take my card, take my email address, write me an email. I'll get you the stuff. I'm not going to charge you. And all I'm asking you to do is engage it, to spread the word, to learn the signs, to help young people who need our help, and they don't need our judgment. They don't need that. They need our assistance. So thank you very much.
A very sobering story, but one that gives us hope. When we return, I'll give you more information on how you can help someone or even yourself. So please stay with us. John Broderick's story is one that can be retold about many of our families. If you'd like to learn more about the 5 signs or more information on how you can help or to secure help for yourself, go to the New Hampshire Campaign to Change Directions website at changedirections.org/NH. Next week, we'll hear from the rest of the panel on their efforts to help people in crisis and what they are doing to train future clinicians. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Capital Connections, your weekly look at politics and policy in Northern New York, Vermont, and New Hampshire.